Beyond the Gate spoilers for Friday, August 15th, 2025 tease that Smitty is still not ready to forgive Martin, no matter how much time has passed or how many olive branches have been extended. The air between them is thick, filled with unspoken stories that neither of them seems willing to untangle. In another family, forgiveness might be expressed in small, hesitant gestures, a shy laugh, a limp handshake, but here, in the tangle of their shared past, the wounds run too deep. And now, as Samantha and Tyrell prepare to face a turning point that could reshape their entire sense of family, Smitty's stubborn refusal looms like an impenetrable wall. For weeks, Samantha and Tyrell had been quietly plotting, stealing moments late at night over mugs of tea or sitting cross-legged on Tyrell's bedroom floor, with sheets of paper spread out like a battle plan. Their mission was simple in theory, impossible in execution: bring Smitty and Martin together again, convince them to lay down their swords, and maybe, just maybe, restore the fractured sense of unity they both longed for. They had gone over every possible approach, from orchestrating accidental run-ins to heartfelt group conversations. They'd even considered dragging the two men to a neutral setting, like the old marina where they used to go fishing as a family, hoping nostalgia might soften the edges of their resentment. But none of those plans accounted for June. Her arrival wasn't announced with fanfare or warning. It was like a sudden cold gust that sweeps through a half-open door, leaving everyone shivering before they even realize what's happened. She stepped into their lives carrying the heavy scent of the past, a scent that brought back memories that some would rather keep buried. The moment she appeared, every ounce of careful planning crumbled. Samantha and Tyrell, who had spent hours preparing to unite their fathers, now found themselves caught in a whirlwind they hadn't anticipated and weren't sure they could survive. Martin, for his part, was not eager to meet June, despite the strong, almost undeniable possibility that she was Samantha and Tyrell's biological mother. He'd carried the knowledge quietly, as if speaking it aloud would invite chaos. Inside him was a churn of emotions he couldn't neatly categorize: the instinct to protect the children, the gnawing fear that old wounds would rip open, the guilt of things unsaid. There were memories he could not erase: the shouting, the slammed doors, the sight of a younger version of himself watching June walk away without looking back. But secrets have a way of becoming too heavy to hold. As the truth about June began to seep into daylight, Martin realized his silence was doing more harm than good. He couldn't protect Samantha and Tyrell from their past forever. They deserved the truth, even if it hurt. And more importantly, they deserved the choice, the power to decide for themselves whether to walk toward June or away from her. When Martin sat them down to talk, Samantha leaned forward, every muscle in her face betraying her anticipation. She had dreamed of this moment for as long as she could remember, though the dreams were never consistent. Sometimes she imagined June as a woman who'd been forced away by cruel circumstances, who would fall to her knees and beg forgiveness the moment she saw her children. Other nights, the dreams were simpler: a hug so tight it hurt, the smell of perfume she'd never forgotten, a single whispered apology that could mend years of absence. Tyrell, however, felt none of that hope. As Martin's words unfolded, his jaw clenched tighter, the fire in his chest spreading. To him, June was not a missing piece of a puzzle. She was the reason the puzzle had been smashed in the first place. In his mind, she had abandoned them when they were most vulnerable, left them to navigate a life filled with empty spaces where her love should have been. Why should he reopen a wound just to watch her pour salt into it? Martin tried to tread carefully. He knew the topic was a landmine, especially for Tyrell. His voice stayed calm, steady, even as he watched the conflicting emotions flicker in their eyes. "I can't tell you what to do," he said softly. "But you deserve the truth. You deserve to decide for yourselves." Samantha didn't hesitate. "I want to see her," she whispered, almost afraid that saying it too loudly would shatter the fragile moment. Her eyes darted to Tyrell, pleading for him to understand. Tyrell's answer was immediate, sharp. "I don't." The tension hung between them like a live wire. Samantha's gaze dropped to the floor, and Martin knew he had to find a way to bridge the gap. He reminded Tyrell that strength wasn't just about protecting yourself from pain. Sometimes it was about facing it head-on, proving that it no longer had the power to control you. For days, the conversation replayed in Tyrell's mind. He avoided Samantha's hopeful glances, avoided Martin's quiet patience. But eventually, something shifted. Maybe it was the realization that his sister needed this, or maybe it was the part of him that wanted answers, no matter how ugly they were. When he finally agreed to go, his voice was flat, stripped of any warmth. "I'm not going to forgive her," he warned. "I just want her to see that she didn't break me." The day of the meeting arrived under a gray sky, as if the weather itself understood the gravity of what was about to happen. Samantha dressed carefully, choosing colors she thought might soften her mother's heart. Tyrell wore black, a silent statement of his mood. Martin stayed close but silent, ready to intervene if needed. June entered the room with an air of confidence that immediately put Tyrell on edge. She didn't start with an apology. Instead, she launched into a series of comments about how much they'd grown, how proud she was to see them. But her words felt hollow, rehearsed, as if she were playing a role rather than speaking from her heart. Samantha leaned forward, trying to connect, but Tyrell's expression darkened with each passing second. He caught subtle shifts in June's tone, the way she deflected responsibility, the way she framed her absence as something beyond her control. To him, it sounded like excuses. The breaking point came when June reached out to touch Tyrell's hand. He pulled back sharply, his chair scraping against the floor as he stood. The room fell silent except for the sound of his breathing. "You don't get to call yourself my mother," he said, his voice low but firm. "You left us. You don't get to come back and pretend that never happened." Samantha's eyes welled with tears, but Tyrell didn't look at her. He kept his gaze locked on June, every word another nail in the coffin of whatever fragile connection they might have had. "I have one family," he added. "Martin and Smitty. That's it." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked out, the sound of the door closing echoing like a final verdict. Samantha sat frozen, torn between chasing after her brother and staying with the woman she'd wanted to meet her entire life. Tyrell's warning echoed in her mind, clouding the hope she'd carried. Meanwhile, Martin and Smitty watched from the sidelines, trying to mask their own grief. They had both known this could end badly, but that didn't make it any easier to watch. Smitty, for all his guardedness, felt a pang of sympathy for Martin. He knew how much Martin wanted the children to have some form of closure, and how much it hurt to see that chance slipping away. June, left alone with Samantha, didn't handle the moment well. Instead of softening, she lashed out, her words tinged with defensiveness. It only widened the gulf between her and her children, solidifying Tyrell's belief that he'd been right to keep his guard up. When Samantha finally stood to leave, she felt heavier than when she'd walked in. The reunion she had imagined so vividly was nothing like the cold, fractured reality. And as the door closed behind her, it seemed that every person in that room understood the same bitter truth: sometimes a reunion isn't the beginning of healing, but just another wound to tend. Samantha walked away from that meeting feeling as if her chest had been hollowed out. The rain had started by the time she reached the street, a steady drizzle that blurred the edges of the world and seemed to match the confusion in her heart. She could still feel the faint tremor in her hands, the lingering heat in her cheeks from the swirl of emotions she had been forced to suppress. Every image she had built of June over the years, every hopeful scenario, now clashed violently with the reality she had just endured. Tyrell was waiting by the car, arms folded, eyes fixed on some distant point as if willing himself not to think about what had just happened. He didn't speak when she approached, didn't ask if she was okay. His silence was a wall, and she didn't know how to climb over it without risking another fracture between them. They both got in, and Martin drove without saying a word, the rhythmic sound of the wipers filling the space where conversation might have been. That night, Martin tried to check on Samantha, knocking softly at her bedroom door. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at an old photograph of her and Tyrell as children, the kind of picture that caught them mid-laughter, when life still felt full of possibilities. She didn't look up when Martin entered, but she spoke first. "I thought she would be different," she said quietly. "I thought she'd fight for us." Martin's heart clenched. He wanted to tell her that June might still change, that maybe this was only the first step, but he couldn't lie to her. He had seen enough in that meeting to know that change was not going to come easily if it came at all. Smitty had been keeping his distance since the encounter, not because he didn't care, but because he was afraid his own bitterness toward June would make things worse. Still, he noticed the tension in the house growing. Tyrell was retreating further into himself, spending hours at the gym or disappearing to walk the streets at night. Samantha alternated between bouts of restless energy reorganizing her room, cooking elaborate meals, and stretches of quiet where she barely spoke. June, however, wasn't retreating. In fact, she seemed emboldened by the meeting, though her reasoning was twisted. She began sending Samantha messages, long, emotional letters that painted herself as a victim of circumstance. In each one, she insisted that Tyrell's anger was misplaced and that Samantha had a duty to see past her mistakes. At first, Samantha read them all, searching for something genuine in the words. But as the tone shifted from apologetic to demanding, she began to feel trapped. Tyrell found out about the messages accidentally, glancing at Samantha's phone when it buzzed during dinner. His reaction was swift and sharp. "You can't let her in like this," he warned. "She's trying to rewrite history." His voice carried the kind of certainty that comes from having already made up one's mind. Martin, overhearing the exchange, stepped in cautiously. "She's still their mother," he reminded Tyrell, though he knew how much weight and how much damage those words carried. The tension came to a head one late afternoon when June appeared unannounced at the park where Samantha liked to read. She sat down beside her without asking, launching into a story about how she had been misunderstood, how Martin and Smitty had painted her in the worst possible light. Samantha listened at first, wanting to believe there was a hidden truth, but the more June spoke, the more her words felt like hooks, pulling her toward a version of the past that didn't match her own memories. Tyrell arrived moments later, having guessed where his sister might be. The sight of June sitting so close to Samantha sent a surge of anger through him. "You need to leave," he said, his voice low but dangerous. June smirked, as if daring him to push her further. "You can't stop me from talking to my daughter," she replied. The word daughter hit Tyrell like a slap. "You lost the right to call her that when you walked away," he shot back. The argument escalated quickly, drawing curious glances from nearby parkgoers. Samantha tried to intervene, but both voices drowned hers out. Finally, Tyrell stepped between them, physically blocking June from reaching her. Back at home, the fallout was immediate. Tyrell paced the living room, replaying every second of the confrontation. Samantha sat curled in the corner of the couch, knees pulled to her chest, torn between gratitude for her brother's protection and frustration that he was closing off her chance to understand June. Martin stood in the kitchen, hands gripping the counter, silently berating himself for letting things spiral this far. Smitty finally broke his silence, walking into the room and planting himself firmly in Tyrell's path. "You think you're protecting her," he said, jerking his head toward Samantha, "but you're pushing her away. Let her decide for herself who June is." His tone was rough, but his eyes held an unspoken plea. Tyrell didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "I can't just watch her get hurt again." The days that followed were filled with uneasy truces. Samantha kept her distance from June, but the unanswered messages weighed on her. Tyrell avoided places where he might run into her, but the constant possibility kept him on edge. Martin began to realize that the longer this stalemate lasted, the more likely it was that everyone would drift apart completely. One evening, Martin suggested they all sit down, just the four of them, without June, to decide what came next. He wanted them to speak openly about their fears, their hopes, and whether a relationship with June was even worth pursuing. Samantha was hesitant, Tyrell was reluctant, but Smitty, surprisingly, agreed. "If we don't get this out now," he said, "we're going to spend the rest of our lives avoiding it." The conversation that night was raw. Samantha admitted she still wanted to believe there was something salvageable in her connection with June. Tyrell countered with every painful memory he could recall, determined to show her the danger of false hope. Martin tried to mediate, but it was Smitty's voice, steady, measured, that finally cut through the noise. He reminded them that forgiveness didn't have to mean reconciliation, and that sometimes walking away was the healthiest choice a person could make. But even as the discussion wound down, none of them realized that June was already planning her next move, one that would force them all to confront their boundaries, their loyalties, and the true meaning of family in ways they had never imagined. The tension in the room was suffocating, thick enough to taste. Every glance, every hesitant breath felt like it could tip the fragile balance into chaos. No one wanted to be the first to speak, yet everyone knew silence wouldn't save them anymore. The storm that had been quietly building for days was finally pressing against the windows, rattling the glass as if demanding to be let in. The clock on the wall ticked with ruthless indifference, each second an unrelenting reminder that time was no longer a luxury. They all knew the truth now, not the sanitized version whispered behind closed doors, but the raw, ugly reality that threatened to unravel what little trust was left between them. A flicker of movement in the corner made every head turn. Eyes narrowed. Hearts quickened. The lines between ally and adversary had blurred beyond recognition, and the sharp edge of betrayal was visible in more than one gaze. They had fought too hard to get this far, yet it seemed almost laughable now, the idea that survival would bring them peace. Chelsea's voice broke through the oppressive silence, low but steady, like a blade sliding from its sheath. "We can't keep pretending this is salvageable. Not after what's been done." Her words weren't just aimed at one person, they cut through the group like shrapnel. The one person she refused to look at stood motionless, jaw clenched, 100 unsaid things burning behind their eyes. The others shifted uncomfortably, the unspoken accusation pulling at every frayed thread of loyalty left in the room. It wasn't just about the lies, it was about the choices that had been made when no one was watching. Choices that had cost them more than they were willing to admit out loud. And now the consequences were standing right here, ready to collect their debt. A sudden gust rattled the door, and for a fleeting second, it sounded like a knock. No one moved. No one wanted to see who or what might be on the other side. But the sound came again, sharper this time, and hesitation became more dangerous than action. When the door opened, the air changed. It wasn't relief that washed over them, but something colder, heavier, like a warning carried in on the wind. What they saw made every unspoken fear feel painfully justified.